Recording. Good evening. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here today. This is the first of our 8-part spring workshop series. Today's webinar is titled The Sweet Taste of Success, Safe Value-Added Maple Products. I am Jessica Jane Spade, the Food Entrepreneurship Specialist for the UW-Madison Extension Community Food Systems Program. This session will be co-hosted by my colleague, Bill Klase, who is a regional natural resources educator for UW-Madison Extension, and our main speaker is professor and food safety expert, Dr. Barbara Ingham. This no-cost series of online sessions for food entrepreneurs and farm-based and home-based food businesses is brought to you by the Food Entrepreneurship Ecosystems Development Initiative. We call this FEED, of the Extension Community Food Systems Program. We're a statewide extension program that fosters equitable, resilient, and sustainable community food system development through research, evaluation, project-based partnerships, and programming like this. So to start us off, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Bill Klase, who is a regional natural resources educator at UW-Madison Division of Extension. He is also assisting with the maple syrup program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. Bill has worked in natural resources for over 20 years, first as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal, and now as an extension forester since 2000. He's passionate about helping folks get the most out of their forests and achieving all of their goals. He lives in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, and enjoys gardening, table tennis, and entertaining his cats. So Bill, thanks for being here today. Can you tell us a little bit more about the maple syrup production in Wisconsin and really help us understand what does Wisconsin Maple Syrup Program do?
Yeah, sure can. Thanks, Jess. The Wisconsin Extension Maple Program was developed or started about a little over a year ago, and our goal is to you can go to the next slide. Is to support producers of maple syrup and other products, whether they're hobbyists or commercial operations. And we do that through the development of programs and materials and post those at our website. The link is here at the bottom, maple.extension.wisc.edu. And we've got a Maple Hour podcast series that we've been started last year. We've got a couple of recordings of those already on our website. And we got a couple in the works for the next coming months to talk a little bit about how the 2023 season went, and a future one closer in the summer to talk a little bit about checking the healthier trees that you're tapping to make sure that they're still okay and can still be used in the future. We also help to support the transfer of the culture of maple syruping among the tribal communities as well as we can. And we work to do that. That'll be coming up. We've got some programs coming up in April around the state. So let's talk a little bit about maple syrup production in the state. If you could go, thank you. So in 2022, actually, the survey of producers done by the National Agricultural Statistics Services found that 440,000 gallons of maple syrup were produced. And now this is primarily of commercial producers, but so there's a lot of hobbyists that are producing maple syrup that aren't captured in these data, but it's still quite a bit of production. And yet, it's been increasing over the last few years. And yet, if we go to the next slide, that production is kind of dwarfed by what's going on in other states in the US and really dwarfed by how much is being produced in Canada. Most of the production of syrup in North America is being done by the Canadians. And so we got a long ways to go, and our program is here to support and grow the production of maple syrup in the state. We've got a lot of capacity. We've got a lot of maples out there. It's a big part of our ecosystems in the state. And so there's a lot of people that are tapping trees on their own and just for their own consumption or to give them out to friends and family that are interested in maybe expanding it and making it a second kind of hustle to earn some money. And so we're here to support them in the Maple Extension Program. And if we go to the next slide, we also try to connect people to the Maple Producers Association here in Wisconsin, and you can visit their website is wismaple.org, and see it as a way to connect to other producers around the state and learn about what they're doing. And they also connect to some of the manufacturers of maple tapping products and processing products. And you can learn a lot about the new innovations that are being done and that are out there for sale. And so if nothing else, it's a way to network with other producers to see how things are going and learn from them if you really want to make the next jump to be a commercial producer. And so with that, I know that was really fast. I'm going to turn it back over to Jess, and she can introduce Barb.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks so much for giving us just a little introduction there. Of it's fascinating for me to learn about, and this is a new field for me, the maple syrup. And I'm excited to learn even more from Barb here in a second. So next, I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Barbara Ingham. Barb is a professor of food science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the food safety specialist for the Division of Extension. Barb has over 25 years of experience researching food safety and helping entrepreneurs navigate the food safety regulation requirements in Wisconsin. She's passionate about supporting food businesses in Wisconsin, especially small entrepreneurs that are vital to many local economies. And she lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and enjoys bicycling, touring, and gardening in the summer and snowshoeing in the winter. So Barb, I get asked by, lots of different producers, and then our colleagues at the Maple program get asked by maple syrup producers, how do I start producing value-added products? And we thought this was a good topic for a feed webinar because many value-added agricultural products actually have similarities in terms of the basic food safety and business considerations. So Barb, could you walk us through food safety for value-added maple products?
Yeah, let's go to the, we'll go through this slide and let's go on to the next. And I'll just give a framework for some of the comments that I've prepared for today, focusing on the questions you just asked, Jess. So why food safety matters, we always start with that, just to give us kind of a grounding in what we're going to talk about. And then a framework for adding value. What are the things you need to consider when you do that? Where to find help for your value added business. And then I've got a few case studies that I just put together. If any of you on today were at the International Maple Producers Conference in La Crosse last year, much of this content was actually presented for that group as well. So let's go on to the next slide and just kind of remind ourselves that value-added activities, so really tapping maple trees is value-added. So I'm going to take it a little bit further than that, but we just know that value-added activities contribute billions to local economies. This is certainly pertinent to Wisconsin, and that opportunities really, it's kind of amazing. You have to do a little homework, but there are quite a number of opportunities for either farm or home-based businesses, even in the state of Wisconsin, which, if we look at neighboring states, is quite highly regulated. So let's look at the next slide, which just kind of presents some data in terms of food safety. So we know the premise is I'm going to be talking about or focusing on food and beverage products that are for sale. You can be very generous and offer your maple syrup to just friends and neighbors for fun. A lot of what we might kind of generally talk about, some of the concepts would still apply, but I'm going to assume that you're out there to be more sustainable, perhaps, by making some money in your product. So that product that you're going to offer for sale has to be wholesome. Part of wholesome is safe. And we know that an estimated 48 million people in the United States get sick from a foodborne illness every year. This is an estimate. It's very surely an underestimate. The data that we have from the Center for Disease Control is about 10 years old. And so we know that over the last 10 to 15 years that our population has grown, and there's just have been more opportunities for people to get sick. These illnesses are preventable and can result sometimes in hospitalizations and sometimes in deaths. There's a cost to our economy, not only to the business, but to healthcare, to an individual losing wages if they're homesick because of a foodborne illness. So we want to understand foodborne illnesses so that we can prevent those as we're manufacturing product for sale. So the next slide that we have has a little bit more what we might call granular data. So this is from the Center for Disease Control again, and it looks at what are some of the causative agents of these foodborne illnesses. Bacterial illnesses, things like salmonella, we hear about a lot. They're in the news sometimes, unfortunately, about perhaps somewhere around 4 million individuals in a given year in the United States get sick because of a bacterial illness. Then there are chemical contaminants, parasites, and viruses. This is not the coronavirus. That's not known to be a foodborne virus, but these would be other viruses, things like norovirus or rotavirus, which might be foodborne. Chemical contaminants. So when we think about maple syrup, and this isn't something that I'm going to present about tonight, but when you're actually tapping trees, we're worried about the equipment that you might use for tapping, whether there's lead in solder in buckets that you might use, and some of that is reflected in the fact that there can be excess of certain chemicals. Those can cause illness, or there can be long-term consequences for things like lead, mercury, and other heavy metals in the food supply. So our next slide, make it safe so it sells. So incorporate a food safety framework. Just be aware of some of the things we're going to talk about tonight as you think about, consider, and develop your business plan for adding value. So food and beverages must be prepared under clean and sanitary conditions. And we'll talk a little bit about those. The items prepared must be safe and, again, wholesome, safe being part of that definition. Labeling must be accurate. I'll just have a few comments on labeling. Labeling is a great way to sell your product, but there are also some standards that we require in the United States so that individuals that buy your product know what's there and potentially know how to contact you if they love your product and want more. So those are all things. So we're adding value and ensuring quality. So our next slide is just the basics for maple syrup. So in the United States, we have what's referred to as the Code of Federal Regulations. So in the first line on the slide here, CFR is the Code for Federal Regulations. Part 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations deals with food products, and Chapter 168 for the CFR, or the Code of Federal Regulations, talks about maple syrup. We have what's referred to as a standard of identity for maple syrup. This allows you to label your product as maple syrup, and someone is then not allowed to label their product as maple syrup if they simply take water and add flavoring agents and sugar to it, or maybe even an artificial sweetener. It has to be labeled something slightly different. So this protects the manufacturer, that there is a standard of identity for maple syrup, and it protects the consumer as well. We know when we see maple syrup, when it's labeled maple syrup, it's maple syrup. So pure maple syrup within the standards also define what can and cannot be in a product to meet the standard. We can add water, we can add salt, we can add chemical preservatives, and we can add defoaming agents, but we can't add anything else. So we'll talk about that. So the regulations might be a little bit different if you do that. And then just language on this slide, I won't read it for you, but language taken directly from the regulations that tells us what maple syrup is, sap taken from the maple tree and concentrated. Okay, so we're going to assume that for tonight, you're not just taking sap and concentrating that sap. We're going to actually do more to it, add even greater value to that. So we're going to start by a brief understanding in the next slide of a little bit about what maple syrup makes maple syrup safe. Not only is it delicious, but it's also safe. And it's safe on the shelf with very little heat treatment because it's got a lot of natural sugars in it. So 66% soluble solids. You'll see that in the standard of identity and in our Wisconsin regulations as well. That relates to 66% bricks, and you may have a refractometer that you're using if you have a sugar shed, and you're concentrating that sap. So you're reading what's referred to as a degrees bricks, which is a way that we can read the concentration of sugars as you boil off water to concentrate the sap into syrup. When a product like maple syrup has a 66 degrees sap, a 66 degrees bricks in the sap, this also has what we refer to as a water activity of about 0.85. And our regulatory standards say that a water activity of 0.85 or below, so either that much water or less water in the product that's available for microbial growth and chemical reactions. When we drop the water activity, we can help ensure safety. There's just not enough water that's available for microbial growth. We stabilize other food products with low water activity. Jams and jellies are great examples. So syrup products, berry syrups, but also these natural syrups that come from trees like maple trees are stabilized by that. Maple syrup traditionally has a pH or an acid value of about 6. That means that it's not acidic. So the acid, unlike something like pickles that you might make at home, and the acid in pickles are what allow pickles to be just heated briefly and safe on the shelf. There's not enough acid in maple syrup. Now that acidity can vary based on the season and based on the trees that you're tapping, but generally it's not acid controlled for safety. It's really water activity that makes maple syrup pretty easy for a processor to make a shelf-stable product. The high sugars mean that we don't have problems with Clostridium botulinum, which is a microbial spore, because at that pH, at a pH of about 6, Clostridium botulinum is a problem generally if something's on the shelf, unless we destroy the spores. But destroying spores takes a lot of heat. We don't need to do that, again, because we have the sugar. So generally, to make maple syrup shelf stable, we concentrate the sap to this roughly 66 degrees bricks. And then for packaging for the consumer, we're going to heat it generally a little bit. We're going to apply a closure on it, which is a cap or a lid very often, and recommend that you flip the bottle over with the hot product. That helps to clean up what we call the headspace, the top of the container and the underside of the closure, and you're really good to go. It's pretty easy for a manufacturer to create a shelf-stable product with that. All right, next slide, please. So that's kind of where we're starting. So safety and quality for the maple syrup that's going to be the base for our value-added products has a high sugar content, a low water activity. This prevents the outgrowth of Clostridium botulinum. Botulinum is a deadly illness, so we absolutely do not want that in our we don't want outgrowth of that, because when it grows, it produces a toxin. There may be spores there, but it won't. We're preventing the outgrowth of those spores into new cells that would grow in the product. So a mild heat treatment. So again, as we move beyond just maple syrup, which can have maybe some salt in it, maybe have water added, especially if you produce a concentrate, and then may dilute that concentrate and then sell the product as, again, as syrup. There may be a few chemical preservatives. This is a little bit less common, especially with some heating of the maple syrup. And then there may be some defoaming agents that you're adding. That's more for clarity of the product, so cosmetic reasons. But so this in and of itself is fine. If we add additional ingredients or things like that, we're going beyond this, and we're going to talk about that in our next slides. So I want to just remind you that there are some great resources if you're simply selling the syrup, not maybe additional value added, but there are some good resources on these pages as well. So if you Google for our Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection in Wisconsin, selling maple syrup in Wisconsin, it's just as easy as that. And there's a page with a wealth of information. What kind of license is required? Often none, depending on what you're doing. What kind of facilities and equipment are required? pretty easy requirements to meet there. What is grading? Maple syrup needs to be graded. And then what are the requirements for flavored and infused syrups? That's something that actually I'm going to talk a little bit about in some upcoming slides. So on this slide, though, I refer you to the licensing specialists. These are 3 very capable individuals answering questions from all over the state. For our Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. Their phone number is 608-224-4923. They can really answer so many questions to help you get started. You also can email them at DATCP or DATCP DFS, which stands for the Division of Food Safety Licensing, LICENSING at WI or Wisconsin.gov. And I like to abbreviate wisconsin.wi.gov, and the emails will get there as well. So this tends to be just the maple syrup. There's a little bit of information on this page for adding value, additional value. What about flavors and infused syrups? I'm going to talk about that. I do just kind of full disclosure, right? It is a little confusing. It is confusing because and that's because you're doing something that's unique. You've got an idea that probably nobody else has. It's going to be a great business idea, but because, wow, we might not have heard of this before, we're going to have to really think about what you need to do and how to get your product to market and those kind of things. But there is help available. We're going to talk again a little bit in a few later slides about how you're going to maybe access some of that help. The licensing specialists are a great place to start, as is the Wisconsin Maple Syrup Producers Association. All right, next slide. There is a map of the United States, and many of the states, including Wisconsin, that we see are in dark blue. That's good. These are states which tend to have a little bit more help than the states that don't have the dark blue colors. All of these states are going to have extension programs. Wisconsin has an amazing extension program, but people are busy and those kind of things. So if you're asked, and if you're not from Wisconsin, that's totally acceptable, but you may be asked by the licensing specialist when you connect with them. They may refer you to a process authority. Some information on the Department of Agriculture webpage talks about a process authority. So if you go to this map, through the Association of Food and Drug Officials, and the URL is there on the slide. This map is, if you click on the dark blue slides, you'll actually get a list of people in each state who are process authorities and potentially can help you with this evaluating your recipe for safety. I will say that you will be working with someone. The regulations require that you bring in someone who's going to help you kind of navigate these regulations. And that's what a process authority's job is to do, is to help you with this. So remember this directory. Again, the slide set will be here. A lot of the information that I share throughout the course of this series that Jess is talking about, I'll be presenting a little bit later, but we have these links to process authorities to help you kind of with this. So let's look at some trends. That's the next slide of some value-added products. There's things like maple water. That's a little bit less popular than it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Certainly pre-pandemic, I think coconut water has taken over where maple water was. But at one point, this was seen as a, kind of a healthy hydration. There's certainly, maple candies and those kind of things. I'm not going to talk about those so much. And then there's infused maple syrups. And because many of you are going to have syrup, we're going to talk about infusing that syrup or doing things with the syrup and adding value. So on our next slide, adding value, we build in safety. So again, maple water, which again is something, I took this slide, I believe this was from some images from I think it's the Maple Center that's in Vermont, Sap on Tap. So flavored maple water products could be perhaps very, very popular, might have a ready market. Things that we know about maple water is it's low in acid, just as the syrup is, and it's also low in sugars. And you may remember that I said what makes maple syrup safe on the shelf and helps it to be safe on the shelf with very little heating is the fact that we have a lot of sugars, and we don't have those in the sap. So generally we might keep this product then refrigerated. You might be able to sell it on the shelf. It's a pretty complicated process to do that, because the process has to destroy the spores of Clostridium botulinum. So if we make maple water, or we take syrup where we concentrated that maple water, maple sap, and we create a flavored maple syrup, then we're going to have to think about what is the impact? Are we diluting out those sugars at all? And I have some examples that we're going to come to here in a little bit. And there may be an impact on pH as well. What if you added something acidic to maple syrup? And now we have a little bit of acid that can help make a shelf-stable product that we can very easily process for the consumers. There's, of course, maple beer. I could find that as I was searching the web for pictures and ideas and things like that. Candies, we know those are really popular. Maple cream. I was bicycling in New York State last year, picked up maple cream. We went by a sugar shed. This was in the middle of summer, so of course they weren't doing any concentration of sap, but it was just a fun place for our bicycle group to visit. So in the next slide, the sky is almost the limit. So we're going to look at this from a business perspective, and then we're going to tie that to some value added safety tips. So we say start by asking yourself three key questions. I work with food processors all day, every day. And so here are some things that I would tell them, regardless of what industry they are in, to ask themselves, what food or beverage do you want to manufacture or sell? So what are the steps to making a safe product, and how is it going to be marketed? These are three key questions that you're going to start to get a handle on. These might be things you work with the licensing specialists on, with your process authority on, and so forth. So let's just, the elephant in the room, the next slide is licensing. So if you go beyond just maple syrup, if you want to sell wholesale, if you want to do flavors and those kind of things, let's just think a little bit about licensing. And then we're going to talk about what some of those products might be. So licensing, often a really high hurdle for our smaller businesses, but don't be worried. But you've already got the sap. You've already got the sap, and it's concentrated into syrup. So we're doing something with the syrup. We're adding additional value to the syrup. Licensing is generally required. Where can I hold a license? You can build your own facility. In certain circumstances, it might be where you concentrate the sap. It also may not be, because those requirements are pretty minimal. But there's a lot of opportunities even in the community where you live. People are using shared use facilities, those that are dedicated for this type of activity. But those aren't quite as prevalent. They're more now than there used to be, but not everywhere. But churches, people hold licenses in churches. They hold licenses in community centers. They hold licenses in restaurants or supper clubs when those restaurants and supper clubs are not open and serving. They may have a dedicated facility on their home farm or home property. I would say this isn't nearly as common because it's the most expensive of those options that we're listing. A license, however, can be issued. It's issued for a location, and you would receive potentially a retail license if you're predominantly selling directly to consumers, or a food processing plant license if most of your sales will be wholesale, so to grocery stores and those kind of things. Any type of license activity where a license is required, once you have a license, you can sell out of state. You could sell to Canada. You could try to beat the Canadians at their own game. Again, we have some great licensing specialists with the state. So a real quick slide here, and the next one is on labeling. I said that this is just something to keep in mind. Information that's required. Your labeling is where your brand is as well, but you also want to share some consistent information with consumers. What is in the package? If it's pure maple syrup, why, I sure would tell the consumer that that's the case. This is referred to as the statement of identity. Who made the product? This is the statement of responsibility. Your address. You may have a website, but make sure you include your address. As well. How much is in the package? We generally have net contents requirements. For something like maple syrup is the volume of it, whether it's a 32 ounce, 12 ounce, what have you. What are the ingredients, especially if it's something beyond just maple syrup, and we're assuming that it will be. We order those from most to least. And how do I trace the product? Some kind of lot coding. At the top right on this slide, you're going to see the top of a honey bear, which is those things you can buy in the grocery store that have, you know, or you could use those for maple syrup, the plastic cap, and you'll just see some information that's ink jetted on the top of that cap. That's where we're finding information on lot coding. And in this case also has a best by date, which consumers might find useful as well. In the farther right image is the bottom of a bottle from maple syrup, right? This is lot coding. Someone has just taken a small sticker and by hand has written a lot code. And a lot code allows you to trace it. So you know the day in which you concentrated this and often bottled that syrup. And it just allows you to trace that back within your records. If for some reason something happened and you had to have a recall, it's a way for you not to have to recall the entire season's production, but just perhaps the production for a day, a shorter period of time. I am often asked the question about nutrition facts panel, how many calories and those kind of things. This is generally optional for almost all of our small businesses. You have to produce more than 10,000 bottles or individual packages of a given flavor before you even start to have a nutrition facts panel. You are also exempted up to 100,000 packages of an individual flavor of a product, as long as you don't have very many employees. However, that 10 to 100,000, there's a little bit of paperwork. So generally, you don't have to have this information. You can certainly provide it. You'll generally pay a company to give you the nutrition facts panel. So breathe a sigh of relief. It's not really necessary to have, and potentially maple syrup is going to look like it has a lot of sugar in it. It's not added sugars, but consumers sometimes get confused. So next slide. It's safe. We're going to come back to some other ideas. Will it sell? I wanted to share some information that I took from the North American Maple Syrup Council. They have a newsletter, and I was just reading in preparation for this program, reading back from a October 2018 newsletter. What do they say about the products that you might consider developing? They say, research your state's maple and food regulations. Maple cream, maple water. Do you have to have a license? That's a great place to start. Dream big and then start small. With the hundreds of food processors I work with every year, I think this is a great recommendation. Have a really big idea, but think about some key products that'll really work for you. Generally things that you know how to do, that you can really add value. Choose a few ideas, work best for you and your business, the facility and the capacity you have. This helps protect your brand. You don't get too big too quick. Protect quality while building in efficiencies. So consider market trends, innovations in technology, and those kind of things. And there may be some partnerships, and I've got some ideas on those on some upcoming slides on some partnerships that may help increase branding. Another slide, another bit of information that I found for tried and true strategies. again, kind of reiterates what we just saw: add value to what you know and love, build on your strengths, leverage your assets, do your homework, find out, what's not on the grocery store shelf. That's a good idea of this is a market for you, and try networking, talking for others. Okay, and then my next slide, again, another set of questions that you're just going to brainstorm a lot as you get started. These are more product placement questions. Is who's going to buy your product? Is this going to be, 20-year-old college students? Is it going to be families? How much product you sell might depend on, a family might want a larger container size, a small a college student maybe living alone may not want as much of that. Why are they going to buy your product? Is it something like, wow, it's not breakfast if I don't have maple syrup and pancakes? Or is it something else? What will they pay for your product? And here on this slide, you can see a link to the small business development centers. They're located around the state of Wisconsin, very often at some of our UW system campuses. They are excellent with this question. I tell processors, I don't know a lot about, selling products. I give advice and it's free. So what are people going to pay for your product? That's something you need to know. And where do they expect to find your product? Do they expect to find it, in the breakfast aisle of the grocery store? Do they expect to find it in other places? We're going to talk about some value-added products next. So I'm going to present you with 3 value-added products. Just talk briefly about what do we need to think about with these? And then I'd love to have your questions to help you get started with some value-added products. So here's case study number 1, infused maple syrup. So this is maple syrup that is moving beyond the standard of identity. We're going to do something with this. So here's the idea I had. In the same community, there's a coffee roaster who has this unique product line. They're roasting beans and they're just being really creative about how they're doing that. And we have a maple syrup producer who wants to add value to their maple products. So we might put those together and have coffee infused maple syrup, right? Yum. You've got 2 of breakfast's best components right there in one product. So you absolutely can do this. You could flavor your maple syrup with coffee. You can flavor your maple syrup with hot peppers, and it would be not only something worth waking up for, but staying awake for, because now that you've got hot pepper flakes in your maple syrup, you might have herbal flavors, all of these kind of things that you could infuse into maple syrup. It is going to change from the standard of identity. So this is something you'll have to work with to see if you need a license, and you may or may not. But these are things that, as you consider how are you going to add value to maple syrup, you still have basically a syrup base, but we're adding something to it. So think about these ideas within your community and what else is, could be cranberry infused maple syrup. For those who live in the area of the state where we have so much cranberry production, that would be another great one, and perhaps a holiday gift or a holiday tradition you might think about. Okay, our next case study, something, again, an idea that I just came up with is, what about maple flavored sauces and dressings? So barbecue sauce is really popular. Sauces and dressings in general, mustards would be in this category. So what about maple syrup as a natural sweetener? Here in the United States that we use a lot of sugar in making our products because we tend to like things that are sweeter. But what about maple syrup and that image of natural sweetness that maple syrup might bring to a product? And there's also that lovely color and those kind of things. So you might develop a line of products, sauces, could be dessert sauces, could be more savory sauces, things like mustards or barbecue sauces. So something like healthy natural products brought to you by nature. This might be something that you would use for marketing, a way that you could add value. You would almost certainly need a license if you're going to make something like this in the state of Wisconsin, but it's a pretty easy concept to reality, because processing and packaging to make something shelf stable would be easy. And then the last case study I came up with that I was intrigued by, because I like sparkling water, and I just wanted to put a hint. So this idea of maple sap, so not concentrated, but maple water, as a healthy hydration beverage. So that was pretty common. Yeah. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, not as common now, but let's say a maple syrup producer wants to bottle maple water, but they want to add carbonation to it. So when we add carbonation to a beverage, we change the chemistry of the beverage. That's why it makes it kind of, your nose kind of tingle, is because it increases the acidity of the product. And if this is the case, it's very easy to manufacture a carbonated maple water. So you could flavor maple water, as many sparkling waters are flavored, and then you could carbonate it, and then it's easier for you, it would be easier for you to manufacture than it would be if you just thought you were packaging maple water itself. Again, maple water generally is going to need to be refrigerated, which might be okay with you. And if it is, that's fine. It also will spoil pretty quickly. So anyway, you could give me a call if you had questions. We could talk about some of those things. But these were 3 ideas I had for, this is how you're going to take that maple syrup, add a lot of value to it, and see your business grow and thrive. So with that, the next slide that I have was just my contact information. You're welcome to call or email. If I'm at my desk, I always pick up my phone. My email, I'm on, like everyone else, I'm on email all day, every day. Happy to answer your question. And now, this is what I was hoping to present. I know we're going to talk a little bit, maybe a reminder about evaluation, and then why don't we see if there's some, open up the mics and see if there's some questions, or if you have a question, you could certainly put it in the chat box, and we'll see if we can get some of those questions answered that you might have.
Barb, I got a quick question for you. If someone makes maple syrup and gives it to someone else to process into a finer or another product, like they infuse it with something, what's your responsibility as the syrup producer in that, to make sure that it's wholesome, as you say, and yeah, I guess that's the question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the individual who's actually tapping the trees, so those requirements are pretty easy. So the lines that you're going to use, if you're moving that sap from the trees into your sugaring house, those kind of things, the materials that you use, if you actually use old-fashioned buckets because you don't have that you're using that old-fashioned system to tap trees. We look at the materials that the pails are made of and those kind of things. So that's the responsibility that the individual has for tapping the trees and basically collecting the sap. At that point, when the sap goes to, even if you do a little concentration or if you do none at all, the individual who's actually concentrating the sap into syrup, that becomes their responsibility. So once you hand that off, your responsibility is largely over. We know for everything that's for just products in general, that the more value you add, the more you can do yourself. Generally, the more money you're going to make, because it's in adding value and moving things potentially beyond maple syrup, which is wonderful, but into these things like mustards and barbecue sauces that people tend to buy a lot of. That's where you're going to make potentially a good bit of money, and your business will just be more sustainable. You may be able to sustain it just because you have enough what we would consider raw product, the sap or the syrup, but very often in the food industry, adding value, all you have to do is ask the dairy farmers how much money they get for their milk on the farm, and what they see for a gallon of milk at the store. So it's that value added that happens along the food chain that tends to be what we're trying to capture often. Yeah, good question though.
Anyone else is welcome to unmute themselves and ask questions. You can also, if you're feeling a little shy, you can put it in the chat and I will ask it to Barb. But this is an open forum, so feel free to ask questions. Looks like Bill, maybe you have another question.
I have a lot of questions.
Please.
But I won't take up all the time. So can you put your prediction hat on and tell us where the market's going to go, that people, I know that that might not be your specialty, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on where do you think the products are going in the future that people might want to try?
I will certainly say that there's plenty of evidence from magazines that track our food marketplace, that where there is movement and where there is money is in these condiment sauces type things, right? So I have one jug of maple syrup in my pantry, and I probably have 15 mustard sauce type of things in my refrigerator. Those could be in my pantry. I tend to store them in my refrigerator. So just an indication, I don't think I'm that unusual as a consumer, but I'm buying a lot. Oh, that looks fun. You know, you've got a sauce that you're trying, you know, you have an ice cream topping. Well, you've got that. And, you know, so when we take a product and we move it into other categories, so things like mustards or sauces, either sweet or savory, those kind of things, that's where we just know consumers are willing to part with their cash. They're willing to add more of that type of product into their pantry or into their refrigerator.
Yeah.
I see Becky has a question here, Jess, in the chat box, and it's a great one. Yep.
So
can you elaborate? Yeah, on
go
testing.
for it.
Yeah, on testing infused products, sample size, process to follow. So if you just want to do this for yourself, so you would test for what's referred to as water activity if you're developing infused products. If you want to sell those infused products, then I encourage you to get in touch with a process authority. I'm a process authority for the state of Wisconsin. I have a list of labs. I'm willing to, more than willing to talk with you about perhaps the breadth of products that you might have available. Water activity testing it's not overly expensive, but it's also not cheap. And so normally what I do with a processor who might have, you know, half a dozen or a dozen ideas for infused maple syrups, that we set up a time to talk, and we say, okay, within your portfolio of products, let's test these. If we test these 3, then we know that all 12 will have enough information for, say, all 12 or something like that. You might have to test all of them. We try not to do that if we can avoid it. Sample size for testing of infused products, the sample always that's sent to a laboratory for testing must be representative, but generally that might be, well, I can think in mils, which is like 10 mils. It could be an ounce that you might be sending into a lab. So it's not very much. They don't need very much to test that type of process. So if you have questions, feel free to give me a call. The licensing specialist for the state may also be able to help. But if you're doing things, yeah, you're going to generally need, and the regulators might ask you that too. Let's see, Melissa is asking, are there any specific value-added maple products that do not require additional licensing or the use of a licensed kitchen? So this is where I direct you to the Department of Agriculture webpage. The regulations have changed within the last couple of years, but the short answer is yes. There has been an expansion of, so we said the standard of identity for maple syrup is just maple syrup, not all these infused products, but things like candies and creams, my understanding is yes, but I refer you to the Department of Ag webpage for the definitive answer for that. But there are things, there also was a judge's ruling in December of 2022, so really not that long ago, which appeared to open the door wider for home-based businesses, and candy and confectionery products like maple cream, maple candy appear to pretty clearly fit within this this opportunity in your home. So maybe to take sap or syrup that you're manufacturing, bring that into your home kitchen without a license to do that. Yeah, so there are a number of new opportunities that we didn't have before. When you get into other type products like barbecue sauces or infused syrups, it's a little bit more complicated. So you'd probably have to work with somebody to make that definition for sure. Right, the ruling was appealed by the state on March 1st. Jenna's mentioning, thanks so much for that. Jenna is so involved with our farm market program. So it's kind of limbo land right now. There is some data that we can point to that helps us kind of anticipate, depending on the outcome of this, what is more likely to be allowed going forward. So feel free to reach out to the licensing specialist. Surely, if you have questions for that, refer to the DATCAP webpage for that. These are all great questions. I hope people, I know it's going to be really, really busy, so you won't have time necessarily short term to unpack all the ideas that you have. But I encourage you to come back to the recording on the webpage later as you have questions in terms of expanding your business going forward.
I think we have time for one more quick question and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead, Bill.
So the infusing of maples seems to be really popular. Do you have to do anything different in that process if you're going to use the infused product, if people are going to use the infused product for cooking, or if it's going to be a cold product? I hope that makes sense.
Oh, so like if you're just handing it off, or if you're
if it's used for a dip versus something you would cook with, is there a difference that you'd have to?
That's a great question. So some of it depends on how do you anticipate marketing it. Are you marketing it as a refrigerated product, or are you marketing it as something that's shelf stable? We generally find that shelf stable products, it's easier to get on the grocery store shelf. If you're at a farmer's market doing this yourself, maybe it doesn't matter as much. If it's a product that has to be refrigerated, then generally you're under a license because we don't have outs. We don't have things that are optional for that. I did see a request for the Department of Agriculture phone number. Sue, that number is 608-224-4923. 608, I'll see if I can put it in the chat here. Oh, great. There it is already. 608-224-4923. These are very busy people. You will anticipate leaving a message for them because they're always on the phone, but they'll generally call you back within 24 hours and maybe sooner. But if you can let them know generally what you want to do, you know, who you are, you're a maple syrup producer, you want to add value, you know, what are some of your product ideas, that'll help them get you to the right specialist and those kind of things. So thank you very much for everybody's time today. It's gone really quickly. We appreciate you being with us to kick off our series, and I'll turn it back over to Jess.
Thank you so much, Barb. I learn from you every time I hear from you, and I just love it so much. So let's give a little Zoom applause to Barb and Bill. You could do this, or even just give them a thumbs up or something.